Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. This show is brought to you in partnership with the Witherslack Group, experts in special education and care. Enjoy the podcast.
This all came to attention. When would it have been? Was it Friday? I mean, it was only Thursday or Friday, I think, last week when we had the launch of this group, and since then there's been a huge amount of attention drawn to it. We've had a sort of a rival group set up that sort of is campaigning for different things or slightly different things when it comes to Labour's education policy announcement. This all stemmed from a document that was produced by Labour. David Blunkett was the main writer of it, I think, and it suggested about 13 or 14 points that were recommended by Labour, or I say recommended by Labour, it was a pre-policy document. So in other words, recommended to Keir Starmer by David Blunkett around what education policy for Labour should be. Things within the recommendations were like, so we had, I mean, the big one that sort of got the headlines was on teacher sabbaticals. Giving teachers a sabbatical for every 5 years of service for 6 months was one of the big ones that got a lot of attention. But there were lots of others, things focusing around curriculum and things focusing around coding, things focusing around creativity, skills, lots of other things. I've got Adam on the line now. Adam, if you want to unmute yourself just bottom left, and hello.
Hiya, Tom. You're right. I tried to connect on my laptop, but it seems to be a phone.
No,
it's
got to be phones only, mate. It's got to be phones only. Phones is the way.
No,
how are you doing this evening? Are you okay?
Yeah, really good. Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty knackered after my first day back. After a wonderful 2 weeks off. So I was slightly falling asleep on the train home, but I've perked up. I've had a cup of tea, so.
Good news. Well, I want to ask you all about this sort of group you've set up.
Yeah.
Because it's been big news, hasn't it?
Well, it has.
I bet you didn't expect it to go the way it's gone.
I didn't know. I honestly was like, when we got past 50 followers on the account, I was like, yes, brilliant, 50 followers. This is it. So I didn't expect that, and I didn't expect the sort of backlash there's been to it either. I guess I was quite naive, thinking like, you know, it's pretty niche, isn't it? I mean, to be talking about education policy in the middle of the October half term. But I've been absolutely just like loving the fact that teachers are as interested in this as I am, because I'm one of the, I always caveat it with, God, I'm a bloody nerd about this, thinking that no one else would be interested. But obviously it's our job, isn't it? It's our day-to-day bread and butter, and we're in an, I don't want to call it an industry, a sector that's quite heavily influenced by like central government policy in a way that obviously the private sector isn't, and even some elements of the public sector aren't so much. So yeah, it's been a really, really interesting, I suppose it's only really been a week.
Yeah. And obviously already, just to fill people in who might be listening to this as a podcast or whatever, Adam set up a group called the Campaign for Evidence-Informed Teaching on the back of a report by David Blunkett and others that was recommending Labour education policy. Now, what was it, Adam, about this report that wound you up? Because something must have really wound you up to make you want to set up this group.
Yeah, I think that's probably the right term for it, actually, is wound up. It was two sort of major things, really. It was, firstly, it was seeing knowledge-rich teaching being described as passive. And I think it was only in passing. It wasn't like a substantive part of the report. And I think that was part of sort of Lord Blunkett's response to this was, we've picked quite a small part of the report in our open letter to be critical of, which is fair enough. And there are other really good things in the report. But that really wound me up because, fundamentally, I don't believe that. I don't believe that the sort of reforms to teaching, pedagogy, curriculum have made it more passive. And then secondly was also the idea that I sort of seen like industry should be having more of a say in setting the curriculum. And now I'm a primary school teacher, and I just fundamentally don't believe that the purpose of primary education is so that BAE Systems has enough skilled front end developers in 15 years time. I think there's a much broader purpose for education than that. And if you look at the report, in defence of the people who wrote it, it's not a school's report. It's not even really an education report. It's a skills report. That's what it was commissioned as. And that was sort of the defence that we got from Lord Blunkett, and that's completely fair enough to say that. But it was just the fact that, going back in time slightly to bring the skills debate into the curriculum debate, it just felt a bit antagonistic, and I felt a bit, it just didn't really reflect what's been happening in education in the last kind of, I guess since David Blunkett's been Education Secretary in 2001. So,
yeah, I mean, obviously there was sort of a, I mean, what in this letter? Let's talk about this open letter you wrote as part of this group. Because you set up the group. Obviously, you got members in the group, you got supporters in the group, and whatever. And then you obviously produced this sort of open letter.
Yeah.
So what are the things in this open letter that you want?
I mean, it's addressing those points that I just said. So firstly, I fundamentally believe, and I think most people who join our group would believe, that a knowledge-rich curriculum is an entitlement for all students. We know that kids who go to, whether it could be your big names, it could be your Etons, or it could just be, Dartford Grammar School. Kids there are always going to get a knowledge-rich curriculum. They're always going to get a culturally rich curriculum. And I actually believe it's an entitlement of all children across the country, every school, every background, to the kind of knowledge that is in that curriculum. So that was a big part of it. That's an entitlement. And I suppose that's the sort of values thing more than an evidence thing. Another big point was that we believe that it's not necessarily teachers' job or schools' jobs even, certainly to 16, to train people for industry. That schools have an educational purpose, that an educational purpose is not necessarily always aligned with an economic purpose. That was a big part of it. And then also to say that, there didn't seem to be any meaningful interaction between the committee that wrote the report, which I think had, an entrepreneur and a university registrar and someone else involved, and teachers. And we just weren't included in the conversation. And so when we called ourselves the Campaign for Evidence-Informed Teaching, and we didn't have a huge conversation about naming, because I think that could have gone on for weeks and weeks trying to come up with a name. But we didn't just, when we said evidence-informed, we didn't just mean research-informed, although that's an important part of it. We mean evidence in terms of teachers' lived experience. So we're the people who experience the hard end of education policy. And so I really think any meaningful policy has to include the voices of teachers in the classroom in order to be in any way sort of effective or inclusive, because otherwise you're just going to end up not only rubbing people the wrong way, but having bad policy as well. And that's what we want to avoid is bad policy.
Let's go through some of the sort of criticisms that have arisen. I know one of the first questions that was asked was, how are you funded?
Why do I laugh?
Does Elon Musk fund you, Adam? Who is the funding behind you?
The funding behind me. The funding behind me is me. What have our outgoings been so far? That I had to buy a coffee in Starbucks whilst I was writing the report. I love who funded it. I'd love to know who they think funded it. That would be amazing, just to sort of see. But no, there's behind that there is a more sort of genuine criticism, which was people do believe that because some of the ideas that I'm not saying we all hold, but because some of them have been put forward by, or not even put forward, I don't know, because basically the sort of revolution in education towards this more evidence-informed state has occurred under a Conservative government, or at least under a coalition and then a Conservative government, and that you could argue that a lot of these reforms have been both top-down and bottom-up, that some of them are top-down, some of them are bottom-up. And when they're top-down, they are coming from a Conservative Department for Education. And I do sort of understand where people are coming from when they say, "Oh, well, then you are AstroTurf. You must be some sort of right-wing organisation masquerading as left-wing." And I can understand that because I used to be quite entrenched in a sort of quite a far-left political view myself. And I think before teaching, I probably might even have been one of those people saying like, "Oh, you are putting forward Tory policies." But the reality of it is completely different, isn't it? I mean, the reality of it is a lot more prosaic and boring. That that there aren't really such things as like conservative education policies and Labour education policies. There are only effective and ineffective policies. There are only policies which are evidence informed or policies which are not. There are only policies which
one
work.
question. One question I would ask you, Adam, is the phrase evidence informed. I mean, my series of questions, I guess, on that would be, whose evidence?
Yeah.
How do we know the evidence is reliable? Is education research reliable? I mean, I know Dylan William has written a lot about how unreliable the of evidence in education is.
Yeah.
So my question would be, when we see this phrase evidence informed, there would be many who would argue, whose evidence? Who decides the evidence? And then to kind of present that as infallible, like, oh, it's evidence informed, so you can't argue with it.
Yeah.
Sort of, do you see that argument?
Oh yeah, 100%. And I almost agree with it. When we say evidence informed, we don't mean research informed, or at least we don't mean just solely research informed.
Yeah.
So I agree that education research is often deeply flawed. I don't know whether you can, people will always take singular pieces of research and say, yeah, this fully backs up my pre-existing opinion, or this completely. I would say fairly few people have ever been really had their opinions fundamentally shifted by a piece of educational research. What really shifted my opinion, because I started out as quite what you might call progressive teacher, was meta-analyses and books by people who brought together huge swathes of research that seem to pick out trends from that research. So Daisy Christodoulou's book is often cited on Kieran Mackel's amazing podcast, Thinking Deeply About Primary Education. There's always, people are talking about what was their lightning moment that sort of put them on the pedagogical track that they're on. That Daisy Christodoulou book for a lot of people is that moment, and it was for me. And that's different to just a singular piece of research. That's trends. That's change over time. And when we talk about evidence informed, like I say, I'm not particularly interested in necessarily the latest piece of educational research as it stands singularly. And we can talk maybe about, the replication crisis and how research generally isn't singular pieces of research aren't that interesting when you look at how they're commissioned and what does get published and what doesn't. What I'm interested in is what happens when teachers make changes in their classroom, when teachers experience what it's like to implement certain bits of policy, certain bits of curriculum, try different pedagogical approaches, and then what happens when those teachers get together and talk about it, which is essentially what EduTwitter for the last 10 years have been. And I heard you talking earlier about the TES forums before that and things. This is really what I mean by evidence informed. It's a much broader base of evidence than singular pieces of educational research. I'm not saying they're not valuable, because they are. And again, if you listen to Kieran Mackel's podcast, you hear people talk really passionately about singular pieces of research. But ultimately, it's a much broader evidence base that I think we're talking about. And so that's why it's important to talk to teachers, because we're the people who are doing it every day. And really the difference now, or not the difference, but perhaps the benefit now, is that we are ourselves more evidence informed. So there's more sharing of information through things like, Impact Magazine or whatever it is, or Twitter, or blogs. It just seems like the profession is a lot better at professional sharing than maybe it has been in the past.
Oh, no, I agree with that. I think the criticism would be that the phrase evidence informed or research informed has come to be characterized by certain pedagogical approaches that many others would not only argue against based on their own experiences, but argue against perhaps with some other meta studies or pieces of research. Let's say maybe not meta studies, but pieces of research.
Fair enough. Look, fair enough completely. I'm a partisan, right? I believe in a particular way of teaching is better. Okay, and I have a values base for that. So things like, this entitlement to knowledge, things like my own personal experience of schooling, things like where kids end up and what enables social mobility, and all these reasons for why I think this particular, and we can use the term, I'm not really afraid of the term, traditionalist approach to education is really powerful. And then I also have an evidence base for it that I could point you to. Now, we've been having a conversation in our group about where is the evidence that a knowledge-rich curriculum is inherently better than a skills-based curriculum. And do you know what? There really isn't.
Is that what,
formal
just to pause there, Adam, on the knowledge-rich curriculum point, because I know you've mentioned it a few times. Is this sort of, because in this report, point 2 said, all schools should follow a reformed, creative and forward-looking curriculum. Are you kind of seeing that as the opposite to a knowledge-rich curriculum?
Not necessarily, because I don't think you'd really speak to anyone. I mean, as with anything, there's always more nuance than the two sort of edge positions would imply. That's not really the part of the report that deals with knowledge-rich education that I think we had an issue with. It was more where it describes it as passive, and this idea that that children just receive knowledge, which, if you've ever been in a lesson which is genuinely knowledge-rich and not just sort of knowledge-heavy pub quiz curriculum, but like genuinely kids are utilising knowledge in a way that, almost playing with it or debating it, whatever it is, kids have a sort of fluency in those kind of surroundings that they might not have if they were taught using a different curriculum. And that's really, and again, and I think, Michael Young as well, with powerful knowledge, and this idea that knowledge can be not a tool for oppression, but a tool for people to achieve social mobility and to be able to, I use the phrase, I think it appears in the letter as well, to be able to engage in a national conversation. If you go and read a newspaper or listen to the Today programme or something like that, then I think if you've had a knowledge-rich education, you're able to understand those things better. Kind of like I didn't have a knowledge-rich education. I grew up, I went to school in sort of 2003 to 2007 at the sort of peak of whatever it was that became before what we do now. And I had this real neurosis when I left school that I just didn't feel educated. I felt stupid. I didn't go to university straight away. I didn't go to university until my mid-20s. And I spent years and years sort of really almost like cramming in my early 20s to learn about things that I felt like, I needed to be part of an intellectual conversation that I was kind of excluded from, like Shakespeare or classical music or basic geography or whatever it was that I didn't feel my school really prepared me for. And I would be really reluctant to deny children that, what I consider to be like I don't know, it's probably a bit archaic phrasing, but to be almost like a national birthright to a certain sort of set of shared cultural knowledge.
So, I mean, with regards to your personal pedagogy as a teacher, do you sort of do consistently the same things every single lesson? I mean, do you like how would you describe your own pedagogy?
That's a really interesting question. My own personal pedagogy. I mean, I started out as a secondary school teacher, and I would say when I taught, for example, GCSE, it was pretty consistent, and that was actually quite freeing for me. And to be able to have a consistent pattern to each lesson, and it allowed me to sort of spend more time thinking about the knowledge. And I remember being really positive about that and feeling like I had more control over what I was doing. And now I'm a primary school teacher. I guess there is a similar approach each lesson, but I feel like there's, I don't know, I wish people could just kind of sort of watch what it's like to teach for a day in primary, because it's a really remarkable job. And like, to say that there's a certain pedagogy isn't necessarily true. There's a certain methodology behind, like the planning that goes behind it, so sequencing, things like that, and the kind of content that we use and how we explicitly teach vocabulary. But to say that there's a certain traditionalist pedagogy in primary is probably not quite so true as it is for secondary, because I think we still use there's less of a distinction between like one end of that spectrum and the other in primary than there is between one end of the spectrum and the other in secondary. So does that make sense? That it's less sort of clear cut pedagogically, but the curriculum difference might still be there.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, what did your letter say about Ofsted? Because I know one of the sort of recommendations in the original report was a national review of Ofsted to ensure that the inspection and accountability regime makes the most positive and constructive contribution possible to the education system as a whole. What are your group's thoughts on this and on Ofsted in general?
Our group's thoughts on this would be hugely wildly varied and thus not represented in the letter. And, I tried to bring together a group of people with a broad agreement on like pedagogy and curriculum and skills and these things. I wouldn't ever like talk about Ofsted because it's not really within our remit, and I think we probably have people in our group who would happily abolish Ofsted. We have people in our group who would reform Ofsted, and we have people in our group who might say that Ofsted should continue as it is at the moment, but with some minor reforms. So I couldn't talk from the group's point of view about Ofsted really.
Yeah. And this idea of kind of multimodal assessment. So this idea that sort of the not the replacement of written exams, but the idea that other forms of assessment could contribute towards an assessment grade for a student. So I guess like in old terms, this would be sort of a return to coursework, or at least something a little bit similar.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on that?
That it's we have to say first off, because I got told off for this by Michael Merrick earlier this week, that we're talking about secondary assessment here, not primary assessment, because there are forms of teacher assessment in primary already. I think that it's not a great idea because we have two sort of tests that we put forward in our position paper, which is a more sort of positive kind of, these are the things that we would say that Labour should focus on. And we say, well, number one, does this reform to assessment, whatever reform it might be, does it positively impact on teacher workload and well-being? And a return to coursework wouldn't, especially if it was teacher assessed. And return to multimodal assessment modular assessment. I mean, you could argue that probably wouldn't have a huge impact on teacher well-being. And number two does it make the system demonstrably fairer? Can we point to the system and say this levels the playing field even more? And coursework, I don't think it does. I've never seen any evidence to say that it does. And just anecdotally, I think that coursework is the kind of thing schools can have a lot more impact over, as opposed to children sat in an exam hall writing exam answers. So those were the two tests that we would put forward. Does this assessment positively or negatively or neutrally impact teacher well-being and welfare? And does it demonstrably make things fairer? Because every time you reform the assessment system, it creates huge churn in education. So if you suddenly bring back modular reforms, every textbook and scheme of work that teachers have used for years and everything that people have been doing in a GCSE classroom, since the last set of GCSE reforms in 2000, whatever it was, 14, 15, 16, has to go out the window and start again. And people are just sick of that, quite understandably so. And we've got sort of, actually, if you look back now, completely disregarding COVID, because that's been one of the biggest, most enormous periods of disruption, but just purely in terms of curriculum and what is sort of brought down from on high since the 2014 curriculum reforms and since the latest set of GCSE reforms, things have been relatively quiet on that front. We haven't had a huge set of reforms of assessment or curriculum, and it's probably been good for us as a profession to have a little bit of a lull, mostly because we've been firefighting on the COVID front for 2 solid years. But yeah, it's been interesting that we haven't had those big, huge curriculum reforms.
Yeah, I mean, there's been some interesting sort of comments on your letter, and obviously this has led to a sort of another group being set up, which is called the Educators Alliance.
Yeah.
Have you kind of had chance to look at what they've had to say? I know that you've tweeted about it, saying thanks very much to the consultants and the other list of people involved with it. Was that a pointed criticism of them, or was it just a coincidence?
Was it a pointed criticism? Yeah, do you know what? Sure, it was a bit of a pointed criticism. Yeah, I'm not, I'm transparent about what I believe. As far as I know, every member of our group, which is I think about 165 at the moment, is I'm not. Oh God, I know there's been a lot of debate today about it, but I think they would all call themselves teachers, and they would all say that they are currently classroom teachers. Whereas TEA, they like. There are teachers involved. I think about half the signatories of their letter are practicing teachers, and that's brilliant. And why shouldn't consultants and Ofsted inspectors and academics also have a voice in the education debate? But to me, the teacher's voice should be privileged because we're the ones sitting there doing this day to day. We're the ones when there's a policy change, it filters through MAT leadership, senior leadership into our classrooms. Whereas when there's a policy change, maybe someone on ITT has to review their program and it goes through that whole process. But it's a point of criticism in that sense that we are, and quite explicitly so, teacher-led, and that what we say is informed by everyday practice. And I mean, literally, I was in a classroom 6 hours ago, that kind of practice. So yeah, it was pointed. It was pointed. But that said, I fully support their existence. I'm glad they exist. Actually, one of the things that really shocked me, so I had went out for a lovely coffee with a new friend of mine who's involved in education, and that we were sort of out in Leigh-on-Sea when this letter dropped, and we read it and we were like, oh, this is pretty reasonable stuff, actually. There's nothing here that we massively disagree with. And I guess my mate, if I'm going to be a little bit, my only sort of criticism was that I caught a lot of flack from people who were saying oh, why are you outwardly criticising Labour? Surely you don't want the Conservatives to win. If you criticise Labour's education policy, then aren't you implicitly saying that you would vote Conservative? Well, obviously not, no. And also 2 years out from an election, it's literally the best possible time to be trying to work with Labour to improve their policy. So their point was you shouldn't be saying this out loud, you shouldn't be opposing it out loud. And then some of those same people signed this letter that appeared 3 days later that does criticise some elements of the report, particularly this irritating figure that won't die about, I think it's 65% of jobs, blah, 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 or kids will be doing jobs that don't currently exist. So I guess that was, yes, it was pointed. And yes, I was a little bit annoyed by the hypocrisy of it. But, it's edu Twitter. People are always going to wind you up, aren't they? That's the joy. That's the joy of it. So,
I mean, just reading, obviously there's been a huge amount of reaction. I'm going to ask you in a minute as well, Adam, about what David Blunkett said to you. Mm-hmm. But before we come on to that, just a few more bits of reaction. So Hamish Smith on Twitter, at Hamish Smith, tweeted, "Hey UK Labour, not every teacher on Twitter is scared of a return to a more creative way of teaching. In fact, some of us are pretty pleased." And I know there were further comments on the back of that, talking about the difference between primary teaching and secondary teaching. Now, I know you have transitioned into primary teaching. So, and you mentioned sort of, direct instruction, knowledge-rich curriculum and all those things. Do you think there is a difference between primary and secondary when it comes to this sort of, the sort of, if you like, the pillars of this evidence-informed approach and movement?
Yes and no. I mean, I completely agree. Hamish Smith is always making the point that primary is unique and separate and different from secondary, and that's true. But children don't magically transform when they transition from year 6 to year 7, right? So I can totally buy your point that EYFS is really a different context to year 7, but it's also a really different context to year 4. So it's not necessarily the case that primary and secondary are a binary understanding of education. It's much more the case that we should do things that are age appropriate. And, if you look at who's in this room right now and who's been, actually it's quite reflective of who's been involved in the group, there's loads of amazing primary teachers here. Shannon, Andrew Percival's here, Chris Such, Neil, Elliot Morgan, they're all here and they're all involved in this conversation as primary school teachers. And what slightly annoys me is there's a double criticism that's made of secondary teachers, that they both simultaneously are saying things that are not relevant to primary schools and also dominating the debate on sort of general curriculum or general pedagogy. And I don't think that's true. And I think, again, to credit Kieran Mackle's podcast, which is kind of a group that we've crystallized around.
Right. Can I just make sure, because you mentioned it 3 times now, there are other podcasts available.
Are there?
So, yep, there's lots out there, like Teachers Talk Radio and others that are also very, very good. But thank you, Adam. Continue.
But no, the reason I mention it is because it is primary specific.
Yeah.
And that's why I keep mentioning it, is because I
know, I was only joking, Adam.
No,
Carry
no.
on.
I'm not, what is, yes, there's a lot of secondary voices out there, but actually it feels a little bit like some people in primary want to deny the existence of the sort of group that I would align myself in primary, which would be sort of a fairly traditionalist approach to primary education. And we are vocal, and we are out there, and it's really important. So no, I don't necessarily agree that we need to neatly divide voices in education into primary and secondary, and then one can never have insight into the other. Go and look at a middle school is always a fascinating example, isn't it, of what they do there and where they draw their influences from. So, yeah, I guess. Yeah,
I think that's why I earlier asked you about pedagogy, your pedagogy. Being a primary teacher, you've obviously founded this group, and I completely understand everything you've just said. I get it, and all that. But there will be many who will say that the so-called, in inverted commas, chalk and talk way of doing things, sat in rows, direct instruction most of the time or a lot of the time, and that kind of approach, if you like, the sort of the model that we see becoming more and more popularized, certainly at secondary level, just simply does not fit in a primary context. There will be many who will just say, well, yeah, that's all well and good, but it doesn't work at primary level. I'm not saying I'm one of those people, by the way, but I'm saying there are many out there who would say that.
Yeah, because they have their own pedagogical opinions about what does work in their classroom through their experience, and that's valid. I would say that I think people often completely misconstrue what traditionalist approaches look like in school, because they base them on what they might look like in secondary schools, and in particular in those sort of like big flagship secondary schools that we're probably all sick of talking about. In a primary school, say, for example, people talk about explicit instruction. You might have year 1 maths, which is taught using a script, right? And this is a really kind of Engelman's direct instruction idea there's evidence to back it up as a way of teaching maths, almost like doing sort of the similar way to that we would teach phonics. It's very like scripted and it is direct instruction, right? And then an hour before that, they're making masks using feathers and having the time of their lives. Half an hour after it, they're having their afternoon play and their squash out in the courtyard and riding around on trikes. It's not this idea that we are, Gradgrindian primary school teachers that lock our children up in classrooms. I love primary school teaching because it's really fun. And because we get to do really fun things with the kids, but it's also really important. So we do really important things with the kids as well. It's all about balance. I think Tom Sherrington has this idea about type A and type B, 20-80. And maybe in a primary school, it's actually more like, depending, and maybe in early years, it's more like 90-10, type B. And maybe by the time you get to year 6, it's more like up to 80-20. But it's a caricature to sort of say that chalk and talk in a primary school either doesn't work, or that it is kind of like I hope that makes sense.
But I suppose I mean, just again, this is my non-expert head on here, asking this, but would the argument be though that with a so-called chalk and talk or direct instruction or whatever you want to term it as, that attention spans simply go lower and lower the lower the age of the student? So therefore the sort of interactions and engagement and so on that you might see or expect at primary, at secondary level, just simply aren't possible. That's what I was asking about in your classroom. When you've done this sort of knowledge, evidence-informed approach at primary level, what does your classroom look like? How do the students respond? What happens when a student, I mean, how are they able, particularly in the early years or the key stage 1, able to go along with that approach, with this sort of direct instruction approach?
So I teach in upper key stage 2, right? So that's year 5 and year 6 the last couple of years. And I think before, when I came to primary, I thought, yeah, sure, attention spans would naturally be lower. Not necessarily the case by the time they get to key stage 2, because it's about that Rosenstein thing of making sure that kids have work that is adequately challenging but not impossible. So you can sort of get kids to parrot stuff back to you. Like, you could get kids to understand, I don't know, Hegel or something. You could get a year 2 class to talk about the dialectic, but they wouldn't really understand it in any meaningful way. That's what I mean by like a knowledge heavy curriculum, where you get kids to like learn stuff and talk it back to you. Getting kids to understand a knowledge rich curriculum in primary is it's what our profession, in my opinion, is all about, because it's about making that knowledge accessible to kids, structuring it in a way that makes sense, using retrieval practice to get them to remember things. It's not all these like a massively a huge melting pot of different ideas and concepts and professional tools that we have, so that they're not just sitting for 6 hours being lectured to. That would be completely mad in a primary school setting of any age. So what does it actually look like? I see what kind of frustration that you maybe have that I'm not telling you what it actually looks like.
No, it's not frustration. I think you're answering incredibly articulately well, and I really appreciate you coming on, and I am firing some difficult questions at you here. I think it's just, I'm trying to get to the bottom of that very simplistic question of how do primary school students, particularly in early years in key stage 1, what I'm trying to work out the different functions, if you like, of the evidence informed approach. So direct instruction,
so I guess
receiving knowledge, all these different elements, how do they fit in at that level?
So I guess in, say for example, key stage like RE, that's my specialism. In key stage 1, it's far more focused on stories and understanding people, because we're building up the knowledge base that they will then key stage 2, 3, 4, 5 build upon. So we're making it age appropriate. So we're not getting kids in year 1 to be able to learn really complex vocabulary or ideas. We're telling them stories, building up an understanding of the world around them, using that analogy that Mike Hill uses about world building, not just in history, but these kids are learning about the whole world in early years. They are learning about, they might have only really seen their flat and our school, and suddenly we're having to teach them about everything, every concept, every idea that we take for granted. The magic of early years is that you're laying the foundations to teach those kids eventually about quantum physics or about Christadelphianism or something like that. We're laying the intellectual groundwork for that. It's not necessarily direct instruction. That's used really sparingly in key stage 1. That might be just an hour a week of direct instruction maths, or it might be just small group teaching. The interesting conversation that if we had more time we could talk about would be phonics, which is a really structured program that does have a really structured element to it, but arguably kids don't necessarily notice, because they've not had the different experiences that we've had. They've not seen the different ways of doing things. So if we tell them this is how you learn to read, that's the only experience of learning to read that they've had. Now the thing with phonics is it really is evidence informed in a way that perhaps knowledge rich is kind of a values thing. Phonics is definitely evidence informed. So that's interesting. I just think that I'm interested in what it looks like in key stage 1 and early years as well. And I think maybe it'd be good to have someone like Julien Grenier come on and talk about it in a bit more detail, because they've got a lot more practical experience, whereas I kind of am sitting in that middle ground, having just taught year 5 and 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and not having taught sort of under that age group myself personally.
One of the things that, again, this was a conversation, again, on social media on the back of the original letter between a guy called James Hanscombe and Miss Smith, who's at Hey Miss Smith on Twitter. The two of them had a kind of conversation on the back of the letter. And Miss Smith said, what we need is a creative primary curriculum, which is curated by teachers for their cohorts. One which teaches essential skills in meaningful and powerful ways. These ways are child-centered. To do this, you need flexible, reflective, well-trained and autonomous teachers. all the things that the evidence-informed movement on Twitter, supported enthusiastically by government and vice versa, have sought to destroy. James Hanscombe respond, I think you're fundamentally wrong in your understanding of the evidence-informed movement. The drive has been to create flexible, reflective, well-trained and autonomous teachers, exactly as you're wanting. I understand you think their plan won't work and hasn't worked. What do you think of this idea that the creativity and innovation and autonomy of the individual teacher, and this isn't just about primary or secondary, this is any teacher at any level, is sort of stifled by centralized messages saying you must do it this way because this is the best way and you must do it all the time?
In a way, this is why I've set up a political pressure group to influence education policy, because education policy is much more specific and much more interesting to me than these questions about these really vague terms like autonomy, freedom, creativity, even knowledge. Maybe that argument, I have to be honest with you, the argument between those two people, I wouldn't get involved in that on Twitter because they're talking across each other. I agree with a lot of what both of them are saying, but they're not really engaging in a sort of at each other's level. They're never going to come to an interesting synthesis of their ideas because they're just sort of talking at each other their points, and that's totally fine. And that's a lot of what like ideological, pedagogical conversations have been on Twitter. I've engaged in them myself, so I acknowledge that. Policy is about specifics, and specifics can be informed by evidence, and by that I mean teachers, and I mean research, and I mean all sorts of different things. That's where my interest lies, because I have a definition of teacher autonomy that would vary wildly from Miss Smith's definition of teacher autonomy. It's just like we just manipulate these terms to mean the most sort of charitable to our own pre-existing views. And that's why I think a lot of conversation on Twitter has failed, is because we're not capable of having conversations using these terms that are meaningful. And that's a bit of a shame, really, but it's also realistic. Someone the other day said to me, oh, it's really great that, now we can have conversations where teachers come to similar outcomes. But again, we need to have a substantial disagreement about specifics. We need to have a substantial disagreement about policy. So I guess I was a little bit disappointed that the TEA haven't put out a position paper of what they want schools specifically to do, like we have, because I want to have that argument. I think it's worth having on specifics, on policy, on manifestos, on what schools, maths, individual teachers, right the way up to the Secretary of State, are actually going to do in terms of reform. Because there's a huge difference between saying we want teacher autonomy and then saying we're going to give Oak National Academy X million pounds to create, and they come out with really specific documents that need to be critiqued and that need scrutiny and all these things. That scrutiny and critique is much more interesting than the bigger sort of philosophical arguments about what it means for a teacher to have autonomy or what it means for a curriculum to be creative. Because I think they're important arguments. I don't think that we're capable of having them in 280 characters on Twitter in a way that we don't just wind each other up like we clearly do on such a regular basis.
I know David Blunkett sort of reached out to you.
Yeah.
What did he say about all this?
So he started his reply totally reasonably, saying he thought that we misinterpreted a section of the report, and that so initially his response was a little bit defensive, understandably so. He's the author of the report, and our open letter was quite critical of it. But once we'd replied back saying, we want to positively influence Labour policy, we sort of describe ourselves as centre left. The group probably aligns mostly with Labour, although we do have people who are members of other political parties as part of us. I think he could see that that there was actually a common ground between what we're saying, and that I think in the future he'll hopefully, if he does any more reports for Labour, or if he's involved in Labour education policy, that he will reach out to teachers to get their say on things. Essentially what I think, if I'm being very frank and candid, what I think happened was that they went slightly beyond their brief. So their brief was to create a report about how we can grow productivity in the economy by improving, by addressing skill shortages and by improving skills education, and probably that should have been focused on post-16 education. And actually what they ended up with was a much broader sort of treatise on education than perhaps they were expecting. And I would expect that maybe that was a little bit unexpected from the people who the report was aimed at. And that was sort of, then we picked up on that and we created our group. The thing is, I was probably always going to create this group in the hope of influencing Labour education policy. And I'd had conversations about the need for a centre-left pressure group to kind of push evidence-informed ideas on education policy. I'd had that conversation literally the day before I knew this report was being published. It just so happened the report was a really good catalyst for actually doing something, and it just so happened to drop in the middle of half term when I had quite a lot of spare time to sit around making logos on PowerPoint and Discord servers and arguing with people on Twitter.
Just before I ask you my last question, Adam, I'm going to throw this out to everyone. At the top of the space, there are 2 links. One is about being a Teachers Talk Radio host. So if you'd like to interview interesting people like Adam on the regular, then do get in touch with us. Just have a look at the link, which is pinned into the space. The second one is one of our partners, which is with a Slack group, again, who are a provider of specialist education and care. They've got a neurodiversity conference coming up, which you're invited to. If you click the link at the top of the space, you can register for that and get involved. Adam, my final question was going to be about what the future is for the campaign for evidence-informed teaching. You've got over 4,000 followers on Twitter already. You've got lots and lots of members in your sort of WhatsApp community group or whatever. I don't know what you're calling that. Are you calling that the Cobra group or something? I don't know. But you've got a lot of members. So what's the plan now? Because you obviously didn't expect to sort of be... I mean, I was going to ask you as well on a personal level. How have you sort of found the attention? Has anything upset you? Or have you just been fully inspired by the whole thing?
No, I've loved it. I'm a massive narcissist, so to be the centre of attention is absolutely my dream half term. No, I honestly, it more upset me because of some of the hypocrisy that lay behind it and the bad faith. No one, I would have been upset if people came at me and with arguments that sort of aligned with my own kind of self-criticisms, whereas it was mostly just stuff that was like really transparently kind of like, well, I know who I vote for. I know what political party I've been a member of, blah, blah, blah. So it didn't really, none of that massively bothered me. It was quite funny in a way to sort of see how transparent it all was. What's next for the group? So it's really exciting. I'm genuinely buzzing because I've always kind of wanted to do something in this space of like policy. It's always been my kind of big side interest, but I've always felt, you know, that imposter syndrome of who am I? I'm just a guy, whatever. And actually, it turns out, you know, there's what's amazing is this community of teachers we've got. You know, on Discord, we're talking about really incredible stuff. Really incredible stuff. We're talking about curriculum, but I personally find it really incredible because I'm a nerd. And so what we're doing at the moment is we are going to create a steering committee that will have sort of people who are going to be out of the larger group of supporters, people who are going to be kind of maybe spokespeople or who are going to write blogs or who are going to be more heavily involved in this. We're hoping to talk... I still really want to talk to Bridget Phillipson and the Labour education team. We haven't heard from them yet, which is a little bit disappointing given how explicitly we've tried to reach out to them. But I'm hoping that, you know, she's been in Estonia today. So maybe when she gets back from Estonia, we will hear from her or her team. So we'd love to be involved in that conversation alongside all the other sort of policy makers and stakeholders in Labour. And then we're also hopefully going to be publishing some more well-researched and well-referenced policy papers. So one is in the works on curriculum at the moment, which lays out kind of what our view is on curriculum, but also really well-researched, you know, really well referenced, so that we can say to people, if you're interested in making policy on curriculum, here is what a group of X 100 teachers says is a really good idea. And if you want to have a conversation with some teachers about it, we can send some teachers your way to do that. Because in a way, like in the realpolitik, it's hard for someone like the Secretary of State for Education to speak to teachers, because what do you do? When it was Michael Gove, he was very famous for just sort of speaking to the same group of teachers from EduTwitter, and he was criticised a lot for it. And so I guess, very cynically, we would just quite like to be a group of teachers that policymakers talk to. So that's what we're putting ourselves forward as. We're saying, you know, we feel like we're fairly well informed, that we'd love to have a conversation with you about, that we're passionate about good policy, that we're passionate about what we do, that we love our job, that we love teaching, we love education. So here we are. Come talk to us. We're here.
Do you think there's a danger? I mean, a lot of the people sort of on the other side of the fence on this who don't sort of back the objectives of the group would say that any criticism of Labour, let's say, or certainly strong criticism of Labour's future education policies or future things is sort of, if you are all centre left or on the left, do you think, oh, this might damage Labour, or this might damage their chances and so on?
That's like, if you give that thought more than 5 seconds of thought, you'll see how massively disingenuous it is, for two reasons. One, we want Labour to have a good education policy because, one, cynically, we think they're going to be in power in 2 years' time, and two, most of us will vote for them, and we want to be able to vote for a policy that we agree in, and education is important to all of us. Two, what kind of you know, if we're talking really politics, like, the people who haven't decided who they're voting for tend to be the less informed side of voters. They're people who make their decisions kind of nearer the time, people who might be influenced by the media, or people who might be influenced by friends and things like that. Are they really logging on to Twitter and saying, my God, the Centre for the Campaign for Evidence-Informed Teaching says that Labour's education policy is deficient. I will be casting my vote for the Conservatives at the next, you know, how many people are we going to sway? Most teachers already know who they're going to vote for, and the kind of people who don't know who they're going to vote for, they're not going to be influenced by a position paper published by the Campaign for Evidence-Informed Teaching on some niche corner of Twitter. We're not influential in the wider political sphere. We're just hoping to be influential in the fairly narrow sphere of centre-left education policy.
Got you. I mean, Adam, I'm sorry for raising your blood pressure, because certainly that wasn't my intention at all.
No, I'm just a very passionate person.
You're a passionate man, and so am I, and I like it. I like it. And actually, I think, you know, fair play to you for, you know, the you know, whether people agree or disagree. I don't think anybody can question sort of the intention, the I was going to say quality. I don't mean the word quality. I'm trying to think of the right thing to express the way in which you have managed to grow this group. It also shows the power of social media as well. I mean, it really is remarkable. And it
couldn't have happened. I think it's really interesting listening to stories of people who were involved in these kind of projects before social media, because this happened. When I say it happened overnight, I mean, we got 1,000 followers between lunchtime and dinner time. It's been remarkable. Like, it's been really remarkable. And if we end up having any kind of influence on Labour policy, it'll be a real show that edu-Twitter is actually important. Like, I don't mean important in the sense of self-important. I just mean that it's been influential on the teaching profession, even though, as we all know, and as people constantly say, it's probably like 5% of teachers who are actually on Twitter, but it is still representative of teachers, and I think it still can be a real force for good. And that's kind of where I am now at this stage, maybe 5 days out from, or less than from when we started, is I just feel like tremendously positive about the entire experience. And when I say to people, oh, right, you disagree, go and start your own pressure group, yes, I'm being a sarcastic so-and-so.
But they did, though, Adam. They did start one.
Exactly. And I'm sure they're finding it to be an incredibly positive experience as well. It's honestly been brilliant, and I love it. And yeah, it's great because I get to nerd out about education policy. It turns out there's several thousand people who are interested in it as well, which is really nice.
Adam, thanks ever so much for your time. Thanks everyone as well for tuning in. People who've been here through the whole thing: Shannon, Chris, Neil, Jonathan, Nikki, Michael, Tom, James, Charlotte, Mr. B, who's regularly listens to stuff. Thank you to all of you guys, and yeah, we'll be back again in a week's time on Monday. So Adam, thanks ever so much for your time, and good luck with everything.
Thanks.
And always remember, there are many podcasts available, Adam.
So many podcasts. We should have a whole separate show where I just recommend 50 different education podcasts that I listen to, including Teacher Talk Radio, which is brilliant.
Brilliant. All right. Take care, Adam.
All right.
And,
cheers, Tom.
see you
Good
later.
to speak to you. Thanks.
Bye-bye. It's all right. That was Adam, and thanks very much to Adam for coming on. If anyone wants to call in now and share their opinion to finish off just for the last minute, I'm sure Nathan has to go. He's been kindly adminning. But if anybody else wants to share an opinion, a different opinion or view, you've got 30 seconds starting now. If not, we are going, and we'll be back next week, same time, 7:30. And do listen to more Teachers Talk Radio shows. There's tons more coming up later on in the week. So we will see you all very soon. Take care. Goodbye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.